introduction?
Oh, I apologize. We were on mute.
That's what I thought.
So we'll start over with introductions.
Good afternoon. This is Claude Dixon with the Office of Recapitalization. This will be our third Q&A session. This is a pure Q&A session. We'll start off by with introductions by the people here at HUD who will be answering the questions.
Hi, I'm Brian O'Neill with CPD.
Sheba Cousins with Public Housing.
Celia Carpentier with the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity.
And also Tiffany Johnson with PIH. And Dan, would you please tell people how they can submit their questions?
Hi everyone. So there are a couple ways that you can let us know your questions, and we'll take a look at them. So the first way and the preferred way is to raise your hand, clicking on the raise your hand icon, and then we'll be able to unmute your line and take your question. This is I think the preferred way, because that way we can get a couple of different voices on the broadcast and be able to answer your follow-up questions right away. But this will only work if you're called into this webinar. If you're just in on your computer, there's a good chance that it won't work if your computer's microphone isn't turned on. The other way to submit questions is by typing them in, and we'll read them in the order that we get them. That's it.
Well, we'll start with the questions that were submitted at registration, and we'll start with Celia.
Sure. Can you read the question?
Okay, sure.
We received a question that said, how can a PHA request to use more up-to-date demographics through the ACS versus the 2010 census data? And I think this question is referring to the section of the notice where we say that you need to use the decennial in order to calculate whether an area or a neighborhood is an area of minority concentration. In general, we prefer that you use the decennial census data, since this is population data rather than sample data, so we're not having to deal with doing calculations with a margin of error. However, the notice does allow a PHA to use the more recent ACS data if it would demonstrate that there's been a significant and material shift in the demographics of the neighborhood. So in order to request to be able to use such data, I would suggest that you send this request through your transaction manager with presenting the ACS data, the decennial census data, as well as any other local data that would show the department that this neighborhood has been rapidly changing since the decennial census. And once you send that to your transaction manager will coordinate this review with FHO.
And I will address the next two questions. Another question we got was, is there any process for relocation certification or how-to manuals? There is no certification for RAD relocation certification, nor is there any how-to manual. The only guide that HUD presently provides is the guidance that we provide in the relocation notice and perhaps the main RAD notice as well. And the third question we received, the question is kind of long, so I'm just going to read the most pertinent part. Basically, what the questioner has is they have empty rehab units which are available for temporary relocation, and they want to know if they can use those for relocation even if it results in the tenant being overhoused. And the answer to that question is yes. You are not allowed to relocate tenants temporarily or permanently in a unit where they would be underhoused. However, you can relocate tenants temporarily into units where they would be overhoused. Of course, that's with the understanding that once an appropriately sized unit was available, the tenant would be moved to the appropriately sized unit. And also understanding that the PHA would pay for the relocation from the unit where the tenant was overhoused to the unit where the tenant was appropriately housed. I think that answers the question. So with those three questions, which were all the questions we got submitted, we're opening it up now to any questions that people may have online. Silence is deafening. Okay.
So Anna Bolton has asked about there being a previous training and will it reoccur?
There was a previous training. I know that training is on the RAD resource desk, so it would be available to anyone who was registered on the RAD resource desk. There are currently no plans for another training, but I would encourage you to take a look at the training, and I think the PowerPoint presentation is on the RAD resource desk as well.
From the original training?
From the original training, yes. So those are available to you to use and view whenever you want.
And the recordings from the first two of the question and answer sessions are also posted on the resource desk if you're interested.
What?
Okay. Next question is from Crystal Mata. Is there a template for the notice of return?
No. Oh, I know. Yeah. No, there isn't. I believe you're referring to someone who has been temporarily relocated, and then a notice has to be sent that they can now return to their unit. There is no template for it. The RAD relocation notice gives some guidelines that people should be given a reasonable period of time in advance of having to return to their unit in the rehab project. And the real concern here is that the notice be reasonable in terms of giving people time to prepare to return to the project. Beyond that, I don't believe we've given any guidelines at all as yet. Of course, things may change, but that's where things are currently.
Okay. The next question is from Deborah Hairston. What guidelines do you recommend for residents who are certified as over income?
Well, under the RAD relocation notice, you have an absolute right to return to the project. It does not matter if you are over income. So whether they're certified as over income or not, they have a right to return to the project. So under the RAD relocation notice, you have two choices. You either have to make modifications to your project plans to accommodate these over-income individuals, which may be taking some units out of your tax credit, application, or you have to offer them alternative housing arrangements that they voluntarily choose to accept. There is no other option.
Yeah, this is Brian O'Neill with CPD, and I think that's a good question. Claude answered it correctly from my understanding as well. So that is the one thing that you want to watch out for, because as Claude said, under RAD, residents do have this absolute right to return.
No rescreening.
And there's no rescreening. So, you should either adjust your project plans to accommodate these over-income persons, or as Claude had mentioned, I think the RAD notice provides some options to provide alternative housing options to allow them to choose voluntary permanent relocation and waive their right to return to the project.
Right, but that has to be strictly voluntary on the part of the resident. They are not required to accept any alternative housing option.
Right. So from a URA, from a Uniform Act perspective, from a pure relocation perspective, sometimes for other programs, we would say that if a person is over income, that they would be displaced. But however, under RAD, since these folks do have this right to return, and there's a prohibition against involuntary permanent displacement, that is essentially not an option.
On the next question, this Q&A is strictly on RAD relocation. We're not here to discuss broader RAD notice issues. So I'm sorry, but we're not prepared to address issues beyond relocation or issues covered by the RAD Fair Housing and Relocation Notice.
Okay, we have a question from, another question from Hannah Bolton. What is the link to the RAD resource desk? It's rad.resource.net, and you'll be able to sign up for an account that way. Okay. Next, we have a question from Barb Tobin. We are offering similarly situated residents over income for LIHTC the option to permanently relocate or transfer to other public housing properties to retain their public housing status. As part of the RAD process requirement, we need to give them 30 days to consider the offer of voluntary permanent relocation and 30 days to move or relocate. Can these 30 days run congruently?
Well, the notice period for permanent relocation is 90 days, not 60. I'm a little bit puzzled by the question. Residents have 30 days to consider whether to voluntarily relinquish their right to return to the project. But any permanent relocation would still be 90 days.
I mean, the question seems kind of like a mixed bag, because it seems like these are public housing residents that are over income, and you're providing them the option to remain public housing residents and move to other public housing properties. So I guess that's one issue that if I understand the question correctly. The other one, I'm not sure about the voluntary permanent. As Claude had mentioned, if they're over income, then there is a 90-day requirement before they can be actually forced to move. So I don't know if,
I mean, I suppose you could have the 30 days and the 90 days run concurrently.
I think it would be helpful, Barb, if we got some more information on it and we could maybe get our heads together as far as, taking apart the PIH issues and recap and whether or not there are any CPD issues in that. I mean, it's a good question. I don't think we've ever really thought about the specific one. And it seems like there are a few questions that are in there.
Yeah, actually, they couldn't run concurrently because how could you send a 90-day notice? Let us get back to you on that piece, but let me parse out the public housing portion of this. If tenants decide that they do not want to participate in the RAD conversion and they want to remain part of public housing, okay, they can do that as long as their relocation is done in accordance with PIH rules and regulations. And that move would be outside of the RAD notice. We've had that situation come up at least a couple of times where residents have decided they want to remain in public housing. So in that instance, there would be no relinquishment of the right to return. It would be handled as a public housing transfer. Shiva, do you want to address that anymore?
It's not my understanding that they need to do a 30-day notice if they're just transferring for via their ACOP.
Right. So whatever requirements are in their ACOP, they have to comply with. But it would be strictly a matter of PIH rules and regulations and the ACOP that was approved by HUD that would govern that transfer.
Yes, Chapter 11 to 11.2 of the Public Housing Occupancy Guidebook, it explains how transfers can be expedited due to demolition, rehabilitation, or an emergency. And that would apply in this event.
Right. So,
Yeah, and I think just a fundamental issue to understand here is that the residents really understand what's going on, and they understand the options that are available to them. So for whatever reason, a resident may very well want to remain in the public housing program and may not want to participate in the conversion to PVD or PBRA. So that's all very important information to get to the residents so that they can make informed decisions as the conversion proceeds to closing.
Okay. Next question is from Maxine Sanchez. Is there a tenant file requirements checklist template that covers RAD projects and FHEO requirements?
currently there is, in terms of having PRA approval, there's just the accessibility checklist, right, Celia?
Right. I don't think we have any sort of checklist about what to include in a tenant file
Right.
for RAD and FHEO requirements.
Right. Yeah, I think all we have is just the accessibility checklist, and that's really the extent of what's in place right now.
Okay, next question is from Crystal Mata. If a resident approved for reasonable accommodation, such as a flat unit, while they are out temporarily, but they have a right of return to a community with no flat units, what is our obligation when it is time to return the resident?
So I think from this question, it's a little unclear whether they had the reasonable accommodation while they were in the original project, and then did they get the reasonable accommodation while they were relocated. But I mean, bottom line is, my understanding is they cannot be denied their right to return because the unit does not meet their accessibility requirements. It needs to be, they can't be left out because there's no accessible unit, or it doesn't meet or have the reasonable accommodation that they require. My understanding is they still would need their right to return to the project.
Yeah, that would be my understanding. I would assume that they had an accessible unit originally, and they would have a right to return to an accessible unit.
Right.
Okay. Oh, Crystal followed up. While they're out temporarily, they were approved.
So they didn't have an flat unit to begin with, but now they're approved for one. And if it's not, that's kind of a bit, we need to talk offline.
Yeah, we might have to discuss that. I mean, the notice generally says that you have a right to return to a unit that has the same major features as the one you left.
Yeah. And Chris, what was the statement? They did not previously have the
And
accommodation.
so it sounds like the new project, they cannot be made accessible.
Yeah.
We'll have to get back.
We'll have to talk about that. I mean, the notice isn't entirely clear on that particular issue beyond the general language that I just shared with you.
The question about a resident refusing to relocate.
Right. I'll read it out. So another question from Anna Bolton. What do we do with a resident that refuses to relocate and they are stopping construction?
Well, the resident does have the right to, is it contest project plans, or,
Yeah.
so they do have that right, but outside of those normal procedures, they would be in violation of their public housing lease if they are demolishing the unit, rehabbing the unit, and they're refusing to move. That would be a violation.
You have a right to a relocation notice, but you don't have a right, and you have a right to return to the project, but you don't have a right to refuse to move.
And from a CPD perspective, what we're looking at as far as Uniform Act protections, that we don't want agencies to evict persons to circumvent their eligibility for relocation assistance and payments. I mean, it doesn't sound like that would be a situation here. So assuming the person has legal occupancy and the date and time of the project, if they're eligible for relocation assistance, they're eligible for relocation assistance. Whether or not they refuse to move, I mean, it seems to me that that would that really gets into more of a legal issue, as Shiva had mentioned, based on maybe their lease agreement, what needs to be done. So, and I thought we had there's some existing FAQs that we had from the first notice that may still be posted online, and I think there was something like this. It was based on the same situation where a tenant or a resident refused to move. So there should be an existing FAQ on that if you want to check the RAD resource desk. There should be some additional information.
But the real focus of the notice is to make sure that the resident has reasonable accommodations when they relocate. If, for example, if they don't have cooking facilities, then there has to be a budget for meals. Transportation has to be provided if there's someplace where transportation isn't available. The PHA has to make all these kinds of accommodations, but provided that the appropriate accommodations have been made, the resident does not generally have a right to refuse to move.
I have a question from Brenda Tillman. It looks like this might be a follow-up to what we were talking about earlier about the reasonable accommodation for a flat unit. So the question is, would the PHA cover the cost of that transfer, or is it not deemed part of the RAD relocation and it's not covered by the PHA?
If we're referring to, a move to other public housing, that would be covered by PIH rules and regulations.
The ACOP should outline, but generally transfers due to demolition, the PHA would cover, but if the resident is choosing to move on its own, I need to get back to confirm. I believe the resident covers that transfer, but I can confirm that.
Okay. Another question from Crystal. Is there a sample RIN?
I don't believe there is. Wasn't attached to the notice. There is not a sample.
Yeah, and this is Brian O'Neill with CPD. There were some sample documents, guide forms that were included in the original RAD relocation notice, but for this notice, they were not part of the notice, and I think the plan of action for housing is potentially to perhaps develop some samples and then post them on the web. That was included in this notice that did not exist in the former notice.
Correct. Correct. All projects have to issue a RIN under the new relocation notice, without any exceptions. However, a GIN may or may not be required.
Okay, we have a question from Jennifer Cooper. Are you going to send the recording link? We're going to be posting it on the RAD resource desk days. So you'll be able to see all this again if you'd like. That's all the tech questions we have right now. If there are any others, please type them in. Okay. All right. We have a question from Maxine Sanchez. My question on the requirements was in relation to the separate RAD file requirements for notifications, rights, etc. for the tenant. Can I find a list or notice of what is required to be in those files for the tenant involved in the RAD project? This might have been a follow-up from an earlier question.
Yeah.
I don't think there is.
I mean, we have the list of information that has to be maintained.
Yeah, Maxine, if maybe I'm understanding your question correctly, it seems as though you're looking for a checklist for your PHA that for all the various notifications and whatnot that needs to be required in a tenant file. I don't believe that exists. I think, probably what you might have to do is to go through the notice and see what is required and what's not, and what should be included in those files. For our purposes, for CPD, coming at it from a URA perspective, we just want to ensure that the PHAs or any agency keeps accurate records. That would include tenant logs, it would include copies of notices, maybe copies of payments, checks received, things of that nature for monitoring purposes. So in the event that HUD would ever have to come in and monitor those files. But as far as there being a checklist, at least CPD, I'm not aware of a checklist in existence at this time.
Neither am I. I think in the RAD notice there is some information. This may come from section 6.9, the resident log, which lists the information that should be maintained by the CHA. And I would take a look at that list and make sure that I had information that conformed with section 6.9, but there is no form for it. Just the requirement that the information be kept.
And in response to the previous question that was asked earlier about is the PHA required to cover the cost of a tenant-initiated request to transfer to remain public housing, they would not be required. It would just be as though they were processing a regular transfer in the normal course of business, and they only pay for transfers. The PHA is only required to pay for it if it's like an emergency or rehab, but the tenant has initiated this request, so they would cover that transfer.
Next question, another one from Crystal. Does issuance of the RIN only apply to properties who have yet to close? And I guess a related question from Donna, are RINs required for projects that are already in the process of converting? GINs were issued last year.
Let me explain the question this way. You take a snapshot of your project as of the date of the issuance of the notice, which was November 10th. If on November 10th you had already issued a GIN, you do not have to issue or go back and issue a RIN. The idea is that you look at where your project is in the conversion process as of November 10th, and you are required to comply with the new notice on a going forward basis. Prior to November 10th, you are required to comply with the requirements of the original RAD relocation notice. So, if, for example, you're at the point of submitting a financing plan on November 10th, no RIN would be required. However, the expectation would be that you would have complied with the relocation requirements under the original notice, which would have required you to issue a GIN.
And a question from Deborah Harrison essentially covers the same ground. Did you say that a RIN is required and maybe not the GIN if you have issued GIN?
Well, if you issue GINs, you're beyond the point in the development process for needing to issue a RIN.
Yeah, and just to put some perspective on that, it's an acronym for what's called a general information notice. So for general HUD purposes, in the past notice, there was a requirement to issue this general information notice that really dealt with relocation-related issues. It didn't convey relocation eligibility. It just said, hey, look, we've applied for this RAD conversion. You may be displaced in the future. Don't move, but just so you know. So I think the understanding was that the GIN being required for some projects that didn't involve relocation at all was kind of unnecessarily troubling some of the residents, thinking that they would have to relocate. So there was the RIN, this resident information notice, is now required for all RAD projects, if I understand it correctly. And a GIN would only be required which deals with relocation-related issues, and it deals with URA protections. So that would only be required in the event that relocation is anticipated, it's planned, or it's a possibility, or it's a known thing, and if there's acquisition, rehab, or demolition involved. So think of it, the RIN is the first step. The way I look at it, RIN's a complete informational notice, the first step, and if relocation is anticipated or involved in your conversion, then a GIN would be subsequently required. Or if you know that up front, you can provide it simultaneously with a RIN.
Okay. Next question is from Harry Kelly. What is the rationale for applying site and neighborhood analysis to renovation and new construction at existing housing sites? Applying site and neighborhood analyses will make it difficult to preserve important stocks of existing housing.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. The site neighborhood standards requirements that are in the notice are based in regulation, and in the regulations there are sort of two civil rights related requirements. One is the minority concentration analysis for when you're specifically doing new construction, and then there's the overarching civil rights compliance standard that's applied to all site selection. But as far as doing a site neighborhood upfront review, we're only doing that for the new construction, not for renovation.
Okay. Next question from Anna. Is there a permission to enter, pack, and store items for someone in hospital or rehab?
Do you mean a permission form? I mean, I would.
We can get back to
Yeah.
I need to look at the occupancy guidebook, but that's more of a standard public housing procedure
Yeah.
outside of RAD.
Yeah. I mean, remember, these are all public housing residents until the RAD conversion. So they are governed by public housing rules and regulations, and their ACOM.
Okay. Next question is from Crystal. What triggers our ability to move residents at RCC? And do our notices have to cite or reference the November 10th guidance?
You don't have to reference the November 10th guidance. In order to move residents at RCC, you would have to have a project that involved an acquisition. Because only for projects involving acquisition would you be able to issue a notice of intent to acquire. And the notice of intent of acquire has to be issued to establish the IM date. So the notice states that you can issue a notice of intent to acquire, I believe, 90 days before you reasonably expect to go to RCC. There's a time period in the notice. I believe it's 90 days. But you can issue your relocation notice and your notice of intent to acquire simultaneously, okay, provided that the time period in the notice has expired. So if you're doing temporary relocation, you have to issue a notice of intent to acquire, a 30-day notice. Okay. That 30-day time period in the notice would have to have it expired. And provided both of those things have taken place at RCC, you can then begin to relocate residents. If this was permanent relocation, then the 90-day period would have had to have expired, and you would have had to have issued a notice of intent to acquire.
Yeah, if you look at page 49 of the notice, paragraph C, there's a section on notice of intent to acquire, which Claude was discussing. So as Claude had mentioned, for projects involving acquisition, for PHAs that want to establish residents relocation eligibility earlier, they can issue this notice of intent to acquire. And the issue is the NOIA, or the notice of intent to acquire, may be provided no earlier than 90 days prior to the PHA's reasonable estimate of the date of submission of the completed financing plan.
Oh, completed financing plan, okay. And the thought here is that HUD does not want people issuing notice of intent to acquire long before the tenant would actually have to relocate. That it has to be a reasonable time in advance.
Right, and when you issue that notice, the regular notice, the minimum notice requirements apply as well. So just be mindful that just because you issue the notice doesn't mean that folks have to move as soon as you issue the notice. So the minimum time periods for permanent and temporary, all those fall back to the issuance of that notice of intent to acquire and have to be complied with.
Right, and neither notice can be sent prior to the notice of intent to acquire, either relocation notice. And just to make perfectly clear, even if the time period of your relocation notice expires prior to RCC, no moves prior to RCC are allowed.
Okay, we have a follow-up question from Harry Kelly about site neighborhood standards. He says, thanks for clarification. Assuming upfront review only applies to new construction, does that include construction of new units at sites of existing housing? Developing new housing on land already owned may be very cost-effective, but it may be hard to comply with site and neighborhood standards in areas with high minority and poverty concentration.
Yes, it does. As far as the upfront site and neighborhood standards review does apply to all new, whether it is on the existing public housing site or on a new site. Again, this is rooted in the site and neighborhood standards regulations, which apply these requirements to all new construction. I do want to add that we have had a lot of PHAs that have had this concern, but I think that if you look at the civil rights notice, it does provide several ways of meeting one of the exceptions to allow for new construction in areas of minority concentration, and a lot of these sites have been approved. So I would really, again, look at the civil rights notice and look at particularly, like we've identified several ways to meet sufficient comparable opportunities, as well as more clarification on how to show that the area either has a revitalization plan in place or that revitalization is already occurring. And both of these would allow for new construction in an area of minority concentration.
Anna has followed up saying on her, I believe it was on her question regarding permission to pack and store items, saying that we had already taken possession of property. Does that add anything to what you guys were thinking?
If the unit, if the resident was no longer eligible to reside in the unit, then if you just follow your normal procedures, they should have a chance to get their things, but after a certain amount of time, I'm sure it becomes property of the PHA if they're not there to pick it up.
I mean, that would be governed by, the ACOP and the lease provisions, I would think.
Still a few more minutes so we can consider a couple more questions. Feel free to type away.
Give people a few more minutes.
Anna followed up saying that the resident is in surgery and will return, but not before construction. So that's a particular situation there.
The PHA might have a template.
Do they have an emergency contact on their file that maybe you can talk to their family and they can get their things, whoever the emergency contact is on the lease file?
I'm not sure we can offer any more guidance on that particular question.
And also feel free to talk with the local public housing field staff if you still feel like you need more guidance.
If they're being temporarily relocated, wouldn't their things be relocated to their temporary relocation, temporary location? So I don't understand why the family would have no place to take the resident's personal belongings. Storage, but you know, in relocation situations, you typically have the PHA making arrangements for relocation of people's personal items from their existing unit to their temporary location, or they reimburse the resident for reasonable moving costs.
Right. I guess another option would be to put the personal property in storage, but I'm not sure, it gets into the legal requirements or maybe the lease provisions about what you can do with the personal property. But under the Uniform Act requirements, storage, required storage is an eligible moving cost item. And in some cases where a person isn't able to rent and occupy or maybe move somewhere and bring all their personal belongings, storage could be an eligible covered cost.
If we don't have any questions, so we'll make this a last call for any additional questions.
Going once, going twice.
Barb, I think I sent you a private message. I'm not sure if you got it, but about arranging a time to talk. If we can, we'll send you an email. We should have it through the registration. Otherwise, you can ask a question on the RAD resource desk, and someone will get back to you.
I believe, Dan, you answered this last question that there will be a recording on the RAD resource desk.
Yes, the recording will be posted shortly. I got a question from Verona Campbell. Is there any further guidance on the review of a revitalization plan or proof of the existence of a revitalizing area regarding site neighborhood standards?
Really, the guidance in the RAD Civil Rights Notice is really the most extensive guidance that we have regarding meeting the site neighborhood exceptions regarding revitalization plans and revitalizing area. Like I mentioned earlier, the notice really tries to clarify what kinds of data and information would help demonstrate that the site meets one of these requirements. And again, and a lot of times these are also just examples of ways, especially regarding revitalization, we've given examples of the type of data to show that an area is revitalizing. However, if you also have other local data that you could show that would demonstrate this, we would definitely consider that as well.
Okay. Question from Zachary Elliott. Is there a difference in demonstrating minority concentration between urban and rural areas?
I think this question is regarding how you calculate whether an area is an area minority concentration. If you look in the notice, there is a difference in how you calculate it. For urban areas, you would compare in general, again, this is in general, you would compare the census tract to the metropolitan statistical area. And in rural areas, I believe notice says you generally would compare the census tract to, I think it's the larger of either the county or the PHA service area. But again, I'll go back and look at the notice regarding the exact language. And I do want to emphasize as well that we use census tract and MSA and the county as proxies for either the neighborhood or the housing market area. The notice does allow you to request that a different geography is used to make this calculation, so you can also propose that as well. Again, this is all in the notice. I think it's look at pages 25 through 26 of the notice.
Okay. I have a question from Donna. Due to length of time it takes to get through the conversion process, residents continue to move in and out of public housing. Is there anything special we should have in writing from the vacating tenant other than a standard written notice of intent to vacate?
Here again, your normal public housing procedures would apply.
One thing I would encourage you to do is to make sure you have a forwarding address for, they're moving in and out of public housing. So if they're moving in and out of public housing, it would be strictly according to.
Yeah, normal procedures would apply.
Yeah.
This is Brian O'Neill with CPD, and I'm glad somebody asked that question because this has come up on some occasions where we're looking at projects and there are a lot of vacant units, and if the required notices have not been provided, then there comes a question of whether or not the folks have moved in and out of the project while the conversion was proceeding before it actually became an approved project like RCC happened, then that's questionable, and that has been flagged in the past. So from a CPD perspective, it's very important that the PHA issue all required notices appropriately and document the files appropriately. So with respect to a GIN, for instance, if there's relocation involved, we want to make sure that those notices were issued in accordance with the requirements, like be it personally served, with a notice of receipt.
Secretary Castro and Deputy Secretary Colready with the Secretary's mailroom address.
So, sorry about that. So just make sure that your files substantiate why the residents left and that it was willingly, that they weren't forced to move, because sometimes, we would question, were these residents actually forced to move to vacate the units prior to conversion? So, protect your own interests, make sure that all those files have that documentation, and make sure that you issue all required notices and also provide support that you did provide those notices.
Yeah, and just to follow up on what Brian said, HUD is very concerned that a resident know his or her options before they elect an option. So from our perspective, it is a very different issue when someone moves to other public housing but didn't know about the RAD conversion, as opposed to a situation where the notices were sent out, the public housing resident knew of the RAD conversion, and then elected to go to other public housing.
Right. So for instance, if you're planning relocation, you're planning this conversion, you do everything right, you issue a GIN, for instance, it was issued correctly, the resident chooses to move on their own volition, there really shouldn't be any kind of an issue because relocation eligibility hasn't been established at that point in time for our purposes. So, as long as you do what you're supposed to do and you can support that, then, whether or not somebody moves after they receive all the information, that's on them. You've done your deal. So, just protect yourself. And as Claude said, we want to make sure that all the residents are fully informed during the whole process and know all their options. So if something changes, make sure that they're fully informed of the change, document it, send out whatever you need to do so that the residents actually know what's going on and can make informed decisions.
And you can demonstrate to HUD that the residents made an informed decision.
Right.
Okay. Well, I think that's about it. I want to thank everyone else. This is Claude Dixon from Office of Recapitalization.
And Brian O'Neill with CPD, Community Planning and Development.
Sheba Cousins with the Office of Public and Indian Housing.
And Celia Carpentier with the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity.
And thank you very much for participating in our webinar today.